So welcome everyone. This is the hands-on session with on pre-analysis plan for observational research. Today with us we have Cecilia Mo, who is an associate professor of political science at UC Berkeley, and also an associate professor of public policy at the UC Berkeley Goldman School of Public Policy. And with her as to assist during this session is also Vanessa Navarro Rodriguez, who is a PhD student at political science at UC Berkeley as well. So Cecilia and Vanessa, with that, take it away.
Great. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. It's a pleasure to meet all of you. Appreciate the folks who've turned on their cameras, so I feel like I'm speaking to somebody and not just my computer, but lovely to see you all. Wish we could be able to do this in person, but hopefully we'll be able to connect and meet in the near future. So today we'll talk about pre-analysis plans for observational research. I know that you got a nice primer from Ted Miguel yesterday around the motivation for pre-analysis plans. And today we'll talk about some of the distinctive features to think about when applying the pre-analysis plan pre-registration framework for observational studies. Great. So as Alex noted, I am a political scientist here at UC Berkeley, and I do applied public policy work. I do work with both experimental and observational data, and my work will largely be categorized as studies that look specifically at political behavior. In terms of questions that I'm largely interested in, I do a lot of work around the effects of inequality on voting behavior and public opinion, as well as the study of interventions that cultivate democratic citizenship. Happy to talk more about my research agenda if any of you all have questions at a later time. So in terms of the roadmap, we're on the top right. Today we're talking about just that pre-registration and pre-analysis plan component in thinking about how to do transparent research. So when we're thinking about the credibility of social science research, if that is undermined, then everything sort of goes out the window, So right now, when we're thinking about credibility, it really depends on the researcher's ability to replicate findings from prior work, And unfortunately, publication biases that favor statistically significant results that potentially reward research practices that undermine replicability and increase the probability of false positives, including specification search and selective reporting. So in the wake of recent failures to verify published research findings, research communities are increasingly adopting transparent and reproducible research paradigms, However, these existing frameworks have largely really been focused on experimental research, So when we're looking at all the various advice on how to do transparent work and how to cultivate credibility, it's really focused on components that are distinct to experimental research. And with that, should the takeaway then be okay, well, those of us who do observational studies, I guess we're just not going to be engaging with this and we can't do transparent work? Is that the takeaway? That seems deeply problematic, So here we're going to talk about some of the solutions that have been proposed by individuals, and this is still a work in progress, We don't have a defined, codified set of rules that everyone has agreed upon. So we'll be noting some of the things that have been raised in the last couple of years as things that we can do in terms of how to think about credibility of observational research. And this is really important in that really important social science findings, many of them come from analyses of observational data, So if we are thinking well, maybe we just do replicable, transparent work that involves experiments, does that mean we then just sort of remove all studies that examine things like elections, war, legislative roll call votes, or social movements that are inherently from that there's wonderful data sets that are being created that document election outcomes, correlates of war, how legislators have voted, and what movements look like, It seems problematic to then just say okay, we don't explore work that relies on this type of data because there's issues around reproducibility and transparency. So what do we do with that, right? And if we look at why it's really important to think about how to do transparent observational work, if we track the share of research over time that has been of an experimental variety or of a non-experimental variety, we really see that the vast majority of social science research is really of the observational variety. So this graphic is from Fiona Berlig's paper, which was in your pre-reading. So she looked at three top economics journals: the American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, and the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And she documented, when we're looking at the articles that were published between 2005 and 2011, approximately 80% of published empirical research is of the non-experimental variety, right? So the vast majority of, at least here, economics research is of a non-experimental variety. And this pattern holds when we're looking at 4 subfields in microeconomics: public economics, development economics, labor economics, and industrial organization. We really say that the majority of papers are consistently non-experimental, right? So hopefully convinced you, and I'm guessing that you're probably in this room because you work with observational data and you're thinking about, well, I have these important research questions that inherently rely on observational data.
Oh.
How do I still engage in transparent research given the things that I'm interested in? I'm going to stop here just to see if there's any questions thus far. No? Great. Okay. And to further convince you about how important this is, there was recent work that looked at evidence of p-hacking in experimental versus non-experimental settings, right? So if we look at the left-hand side graphic, we're looking at the distribution of Z statistics. And if we do not see, so the left-hand side is experimental, right-hand side is non-experimental. And so both of these graphics are just showing the distribution of Z statistics among results of studies that were published in AER, JP, and QJE. So again, top 3 economics journals. So if we see no evidence of p-hacking, there should just be one peak, right? Sort of kind of like a normal distribution. If we see evidence of p-hacking, we might see 2 peaks where the second peak is right at sort of that desired threshold, which typically is that 0.05 or a Z statistic of 1.96. So on the left panel, when we're looking at experimental studies, we see evidence of, a slight second peak, though when you analyze the data, you don't really see statistically significant evidence of there actually being like 2 distinct peaks. The larger problem is when we're looking at observational studies. There we see 2 distinct peaks, right? There is a notable peak right at that 1.96 Z statistic. So when we're looking at the body of work, it seems like there is more evidence of p-hacking going on among non-experimental papers, which again sort of showcases why it's really important for those of us who are doing observational studies to think about, well, how do we engage in doing transparent work? So what is the purpose of pre-registration, right? So I'm sure that with your session earlier, you went through that it provides a nice document that's public facing for readers to be able to look at to see, well, what was your plan, right? And how does your plan compare to what you eventually actually published, right? So it provides sort of a record of what your plan is before then you produce that final result, because otherwise readers will only really see that final result and not necessarily know if that published article is reflective of what the researcher's plan was, right, at the outset. It limits researcher degrees of freedom so that we don't see issues around p-hacking and specification search that then would lead to an outcome where the authors are sort of incentivized to do that, thinking that if they have a statistically significant finding, there's greater likelihood of getting published. Right? And the pre-registration process is also designed to really encourage well thought out projects with strong theoretical and empirical justifications, right? So when you don't have the data to already manipulate, all you have is thinking about, well, what are my hypotheses and what are the right tests to run in light of what my research questions are and what I think I'll be able to have within my data. Right? So if you don't have that and say, we just say like, oh, we're just going to look at, all types of empirical strategies, that's something that some authors have proposed so that you can maybe create sort of this bound of, depending on what kind of specification you have, you might see the sort of range of statistical significance, but that really risks kind of pushing theory into the background, right? Because if we're thinking about what should the theory justify, sort of any and all types of specifications shouldn't be treated as equal, right? There may be a set of specifications that might be useful to pursue, but just sort of saying like we're going to pursue a broad range of specifications and see what the ranges are, that might not be sort of the best in terms of noting, well, what is the right well-justified specification given the theory that is being tested and given what we know about the data. So how do observational studies fit into the research transparency landscape, right? So we went through why it's really important for those of us who do observational work to think about doing transparent research, but how does this all fit? So the issue with observational data is that it often relies on public data, right? So the data that I noted earlier to sort of indicate that observational work like really explores important questions like elections or conflict or social movements, that often means that authors are then relying on public data, which is really great for transparency, right, and equity. Like all people have that data at their fingertips, so everyone can sort of look at that data and test it. So that's a good thing. However, it really takes away from the ability to then say credibly, I have pre-registered my study before I have looked at any of the data. You might have sort of done that for yourself, but sort of credibly noting to the world that that's what you did, it's sort of the, well, just trust me, right? No one can actually verify that you truly did not look at the data and peek before you put your pre-analysis plan together. Right? And so that poses as sort of the largest challenge as it relates to the usage of observational data. So, right? And if you're sort of thinking about like, is that the case? Like, let's think about some prominent data sets like the World Bank Living Standard Measurement studies all around the world, right? Everyone has access to that, which is great, but really hard to claim that you haven't seen that before credibly. Or the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth of 1979, where there are 27 rounds of data collection of a panel, which is amazing and rich data that like researchers should really explore. Really hard to say that you didn't look at it. Or the 2016 American National Election Study, right? All these ANES studies that take place with each election. Again, useful to use, but hard to really verify that you as the researcher did not look and peek at the data. So when we're thinking about, well, what do we do with that? Right? And unfortunately, the answer is not like, well, like, let's not worry about it. We can still figure out a plan. I think there are some ways to improve for everyone, but when we're thinking about scenarios where credible pre-registration is possible, Fiona Berlig in 2018 noted 3. Right? And after I note these, I'll also share some other options that some co-authors and I have been developing. So in terms of what setting can we credibly pre-register when we're looking at observational data? First, pretty simple, observational analysis on any researcher-generated data, right? No brainer. You can also think about doing observational analysis on not yet released data. So if we're thinking about various data that have like a time series, and you know that there's another round that's going to be available in like a year from now or a couple months, you can pre-register that because you know that it's coming, but you have not yet had access to it, like because no one has access to it. And then we can also credibly pre-register any observational studies that's using restricted access data. Okay. I'll talk a little bit more about each of these three. So as I said with scenario one, for researcher generated data, that's probably the simplest, right? And really all the well-developed pre-analysis plan guidance for experimental research is really applicable here because the data hasn't been collected. It's data that you are going to collect. And it's easier for you to write this because you're familiar with the structure of the data set. You'll have more clarity around what kind of measures you're working with. And you have greater control over the data collection timeline to ensure that pre-analysis plan is registered before data is analyzed, right? So scenario one, pretty simple. It's not as though only experimental studies involve sort of original data sets that the authors generate. So if you are generating your own data, then this is a prime setting where a credible pre-registration plan is viable. So scenario two, prospective analysis. This type of pre-analysis plan is actually older than one might think. To our knowledge, the first ever economics study that was pre-registered was of this variety, a prospective analysis of observational data. That was David Newmark. In 1999 and 2001, he wrote a pre-analysis plan to study the impact of the October 1996 US federal minimum wage increase. Right? It's crazy to think that pre-analysis plans have really only been around for about 2 decades. But the first one, to our knowledge on record, is one that was actually of an observational study that was of a prospective variety, right? The author was aware that data was going to become available. And because he knew that data was going to become available, he noted his plan for what he was going to do when that data was going to be made available. And many data sets are really amenable to this kind of pre-specification, right? When we're thinking about large administrative data sets like the census, World Bank LSMS series data, election surveys, those are announced, right? We often have visibility in terms of that data that's going to be collected and when it's going to become available. And in many of these cases, there are multiple waves of data that's being collected, and surveys, like the survey instruments, are fully published in advance. So you are going to be aware of, well, what kind of measures can I leverage to do my study? So these data sets are often really amenable to prospective pre-specification. And then the final scenario that Fiona Burlick notes is pre-analysis plan for restricted access data. Right? So what we mean by restricted access data is when we're accessing data that you don't own, that some other partner has proprietary ownership over, and you are able to gain access through some kind of process. Right? So it could be healthcare data, it can be information about a particular firm, it could be spatial information, what have you. There's a lot of data that's being generated out in the world that you don't have access to, that the world doesn't just have free access to. It's completely confidential, but there may be some process to gain access through some kind of non-disclosure agreement process. Right? And that kind of data really allows for a credible pre-registration process because you can really argue fairly well that you haven't seen the data in advance of pre-registering, right? The data use agreement that's usually involved in accessing this restricted data acts as a transfer record, right? There's a timestamp that's provided there that can then be provided to the world to showcase, I did not have access to the data like before I pre-registered my process, like my study, right? So given that there is this official record with a timestamp, it really lends itself for being able to do a very credible pre-registration process. Right? And I'm not sure if any of you have been involved in this sort of data use agreement process, but these data requests and non-disclosure agreements often require a description of the data that you want, a discussion of the research question, right? What are you going to do with the data? And it often details some aspect of the design process, right? Those entities who are entrusting you with confidential data want to know what you're going to do with it. So oftentimes the act of generating a non-disclosure agreement and doing the data request forces you to actually lay out the kinds of questions you need to answer for a good, sound pre-analysis plan. So the effort that's needed to really convert to a full pre-analysis plan is fairly minimal in light of the alignment between questions that partners will ask of researchers requesting to see the data and questions that need to be answered in a pre-analysis plan. Pause just to see if there's any questions so far.
You're good.
Right. So if you're following along, you might like, okay, well, that's great. But if it's confidential, it can actually create another type of transparency issue, right? If it's confidential, it also means that you can't just make it available freely when you are publishing the data to say anyone who's interested in looking at my findings, like go ahead, like you can look at my command files, you can look at everything and replicate my work. That's something that is not like that you don't have permission to do. So it creates another kind of transparency issue. It also creates some issues in terms of what journals you can access, because different journals may have different policies regarding data replication files, right? So if you actually don't have ownership over the data to be able to then lend to some kind of data bank, replication file data bank for journals to send readers, then journals might not actually allow you to publish there. But there's differences. So the flagship top journal in political science, the American Political Science Review, I just put up the policy there in terms of its submission guidelines. They do have explicit note that they do want the full quantitative research like preparation files that need to be put into their Dataverse. But note sort of the end, unless legal, ethical, or methodological constraints prevent such data sharing. So there could be, with confidential data, you can create transparency on the front end, but there may be some problems on the back end in terms of transparency. And at least for now, there's a broad range of journals that are still willing to publish that data because they're sort of seeing the value of having that kind of work be published. And when you're looking at various Twitter feeds between like journal editors, right? So Michael White and Fiona Burlig are having this conversation around what can be published in Nature, right? A top journal that a lot of researchers would be interested in publishing. And he's noting like if we're ultimately able to offer publication of your paper, we will require that your underlying data set be available at the time of publication in a public repository, right? Like that was the starting point. And then Fiona Burlig noted, well, does that mean that research produced using data under an NDA can't be published in Nature journals? Right? And then there's questions like, well, what kind of data? And then he backtracks at the end, well, I very much suspect, but would have to confirm that we would be okay with cases like this, right? So there's still an ongoing conversation around like, what do you do with confidential data? Because on the one hand, this data is often very rich, right? Thinking about like all of the various kinds of data that private firms might be collecting, that governments might be creating, that nonprofits might be generating. There's very rich data there. And do we not publish on research that's using that very valuable data because you can't fully share it? For now, many journals are siding with, okay, we can probably create some exceptions, but not all. And when we're looking at the number of studies that are being published that is of this confidential data variety, we're seeing that that's growing, right? So if we look at the American Economic Review, right, the top economics journal, we see that 45% of empirical papers were exempted from sharing in 2016. So the fraction and share of studies that are using this exempt data where you can't publicly share given data use agreements, AER is actually publishing more of that kind of studies, in spite of the fact that there are some transparency issues on the back end. But hopefully I've convinced you that we can have transparency on the front end because there's no reason why a pre-registration plan can't be created for this type of study. Now, with that said, there are some things that you can do to try to create a little bit more transparency on the back end. So this is an example of a paper that I wrote that was using confidential data where I had a data use agreement, so it was not my data to share, right? So what I did was I created and had, like, through a conversation with the organization that shared this data, in this case TFA was Teach for America, we created sort of a stripped down version of their raw data that could only be used for the purposes of replication, right? So in the Dataverse file, there was a confidentiality agreement that was created between me and TFA to then make available to all readers. So if the readers wanted to replicate my findings, that they can get sort of the bare minimum that's needed to assess the accuracy and validity of my findings, and then sort of commit in and like have an agreement with TFA saying, I am only using this data for the purposes of replication and nothing else. So there are ways to try to create some more transparency on the back end, but this is certainly at the mercy and preference of the organization that's providing that confidential data. But I would challenge you to not say like, okay, if it's confidential data, there is nothing that I can do, because I think there's a greater understanding among the practitioner and academic community that transparency is important. And so with that, there may be amenability to creating these kinds of confidentiality agreement for the pure purposes of replication and creating transparency. Any questions?
Hi, Cecilia. We have two questions right now, Stephen and then Rohit. Sorry if I mispronounced your name.
Yeah, Stephen, go ahead.
Sure. So one question I had is, what counts as having looked at the data? So in my head, that's like you've downloaded it and actually like gone through it. But yeah, I mean, if it's just released like on the website and I go to the General Social Survey website and I say like, all right, do they have measures on topic X? Does that count as having looked?
Yeah, that's a really good question. As technically you didn't, right? Because all you did was you looked at, well, what is the nature of the data set? You didn't analyze it, like you weren't doing anything to figure out whether or not the data could, like what you need to do with the data to massage it, to have it say what you want to say, and then pre-registering that, right? Like that's the worry, that you're pre-registering something that you've already sort of figured out and cooked. And technically you didn't. And so that the issue there is, how do you convince the world that you didn't, right? So like that goes back to the, well, trust me, I assure you I didn't. And so there have been conversations like, well, you know, we can believe that maybe the vast majority of researchers, like when they say, I didn't look at it, that's truly what they mean, right? But when we've seen evidence of full-on fraud that researchers have done, sort of like ruin it for all of us, right? In terms of like, well, can we really be convinced and with confidence that all the researchers who say like, I assure you I haven't looked at it, like, can we believe that? And that goes into then that credibility question again, right? And which is why I've been thinking about like, well, when are there scenarios in which like we as like a full community can fully buy like I'm pretty sure that they didn't peak, right? So unfortunately, you're noting a scenario in which like you honestly didn't peak and you're trying to be very honest about that process, but technically there isn't this sort of timestamp or evidence. So data that is really expensive, right? That might be one in which like you can sort of convince, right? Because you might have a receipt for when you actually got that data. And so you can show like, well, I don't just have like $5,000 like laying around to buy this data. I bought this data after I did my pre-specification and like registered my pre-analysis plan. And that timestamp is before that receipt for downloading that data. But if it's say something like filling out a no cost like online form to download the data, that like anyone can do multiple times, and that starts going like, well, the barrier for getting that data is really low, and as a result, while you know like most of us be like you know seem like an honest guy and we trust that, unfortunately there isn't a process for the whole research community to say like, yes, like you know he credibly pre-specified this before actually analyzing the data. I will propose like one solution in a second that's still controversial, but it's something that we're sort of proposing as like maybe this is another way to create like another space for having credibility in spite of the fact that you can just you know go and download it freely.
Yeah.
And then there was a second question.
Rohit, and then there is 3 more after him.
Hi, Cecilia. Thank you. I'm referring to your slide on Fiona Berlick's paper. So when you talk about the data exemptions, I want to understand this. Are you talking about these confidential data that's like embargoed for about 6 to 12 months, or are we going about like a much larger? I'm talking about the graph that you just showed. I think it was from, we were talking about AER statistics.
This one?
Yes, this one. So, so are these like for even for the ones that do have access? So, is there a possibility that, say, within 3 months of publishing, everybody can access the confidential data, but not after that? So, is there a time, or is it like forever banned for a lot of people?
Got it.
So I want to
Yeah.
understand that.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense because in some cases, like an author might be able to sort of embargo the data, right? And so it's like embargoed until the authors are able to fully publish, and the rest of the world can't access that data until that publication comes into play. So these numbers reflect not the embargoed variety, right? Because the embargoed variety, like that data then becomes freely available within a certain time frame. As you noted, it could be like a month, it could be 3 months, it could be 6 months or so forth. This is of the variety where you actually have to go through some kind of data use agreement with some firm organization that owns the data, right? So it's not as though no one can access the data. It's just that the barrier is high in that you actually have to sign sort of a contract to access that data and gain permission from the owner of that data. And so as a result, the authors can't just freely make that data available for the purposes of data transparency and the enabling replication. Good question. I think there was a third question.
Yeah, Anne Furbush.
Yeah, I was just curious how this might limit researchers from using the same restricted data again in a subsequent study. Do researchers then feel like they can only use it once because then they can only credibly pre-register it once?
That is a great question. And so in terms of credibility, I guess it depends on whether or not the initial data use agreement had sort of that plan for like multiple questions, right? So if you had that foresight, then like you're able to have credibly be able to sort of justify multiple questions because it's like all in that pre-analysis plan. But I realized sort of in the process of actually doing research, it's you analyze it, right? And then you're like, huh, there's these like secondary questions and there's this other interesting pattern that I didn't foresee that was not there to begin with, right? And then it might then involve a conversation with the original firm that allowed you to gain that data to see like, can I use this data for this purpose? But unfortunately, the NDA, the DUA doesn't sort of buy you the same kind of timestamp for that work. And this is not to say that like researchers shouldn't then pursue that kind of work. It just means that unfortunately, there isn't a credible process for really pre-registering and having pre-specified that analysis, right? So right now, it means that a lot of observational studies don't really transfer well for doing pre-specification, like a full pre-analysis plan in terms of like being fully credible to the rest of the world. Again, like in a moment, I'll propose some alternative solutions because that is sort of depressing to think like, well, for those of us who are wanting to be really transparent and have our observational studies be pre-registered, like, are we then like of the like, well, I tried to do the best I can, but unfortunately I can't credibly prove to you, because that's sort of how it's been so far, right? So most of these observational studies, which is the lion's share of published work, the lion's share of really important kinds of research, because the kinds of studies that like the kinds of data that lend itself for doing important work, like it's observational in nature. We're sort of at a moment in which like most of those studies are not pre-registered, right? The vast majority of pre-registered studies are experiments. And we're like now only sort of like going and trying to figure this out because as I showed you, there's clear evidence of p-hacking and some issues around credibility with observational studies. So it behooves us all to think through like, well, how do we engage with this? Like, are there ways to do it better, even though we're not moving? Like we're only sort of like moving the needle. We're not sort of like getting to the finish line and be like, yep, we're all here with you with experiments. Like we're there. We can fully do this. Unfortunately, we can't quite do that because a lot of this is trying to create timestamps and documentation, where if we then create more barriers, that's also problematic too, right? In terms of access for scholars. So sort of adding barriers seems like a problem. So what are other things that we can do that we all sort of agree upon that like, oh, it's viable? And so for now, I'm sort of noting, well, these three scenarios, which were only noted right in 2018, right? Like we're only recently having this conversation. There's sort of like three scenarios that have been identified as, okay, like these seem credible. And now it's like, well, can we do more? Like, are there other ways to do, to be able to do credible work that's transparent for those of us who do observational studies? Okay, so recap, right? This most recent work is sort of noting these like three scenarios, but are there others? So I'm gonna share just a little bit from forthcoming work in the journal Politics that I did with some colleagues at Yale and Stanford to think through an observational open science approach. But here it's really looking at studies around like replications, right? So pre-registration is really important when social scientists replicate or test the robustness of observational studies, because if we're looking at debates that are being had about a particular research question, when we see sort of a follow-up study, we've often noticed that the follow-up scholars are making significant modifications to the original research strategy. So then the question becomes, well, did you find a different result because you're using a different design plan? And then the fight is, well, whose design plan is the better one to use? And so you get sort of mired in this controversy around like, well, which specification, right? It's like, well, in these specifications, you see a significant finding. In these specifications, you see an insignificant finding. Like, who is right? And then other times it's just introducing a whole new case altogether as an example of studying the particular phenomena that a study has been looking at. And that doesn't quite lend itself for a nice like replication study, because when we're looking at a different case, like a different country case, there are other things that are going on, right? Like when we're saying like, well, we see this finding when we're doing an analysis in Guinea, but when we do a very similar analysis in India, we see something else. Well, that doesn't quite pass muster in terms of like, well, is that really a replication? Because there's other contextual differences about Guinea and India. So that can't be sort of evidence for a particular study being true or not. Like that's then really questions around like external validity, right? So when we've been looking at replication studies of observational work, I'm sure you've heard of p-hacking. With observational studies, replication studies, we have now come to be worried about sort of a very similar pathology, but of the reverse, null hacking, right? So if you're thinking about the motivations of someone trying to replicate like an important observational study, the sort of punchy finding is that this original study that's highly cited is wrong, right? That's the punchy finding. So when we're thinking about the incentives of the producer of an original study, it may be on the side of p-hacking, right? To show that there's some significant relationship, right? Like that sounds more interesting and may be able to convince editors and reviewers that it's more interesting. But when we're thinking about replication studies, we're now worried about null hacking because the headline is like, if there's sort of an article that says like, this highly cited work is wrong, right? Like that feels more punchy. And so with replication studies, we have found that there needs to be work to prevent null hacking, right? You can specification search a way to like make that p-value be above 0.05, right? That's the worry. So how do we make pre-analysis plans or replication studies more credible? And I think some of these here can also be used for thinking about non-replication studies. And this doesn't sort of get to the level of, I think, believability and the non-controversial 3 scenarios that Fiona Berlich raised. But one thing that we're trying to note is the use of teams, right? So for replication studies, we propose that there's real value in having teams with mixed incentives. So having, say, original authors who may be incentivized to replicate the initial finding and new authors who may actually be incentivized to null hack and have them sort of agree on a plan. So this was a strategy that we tried in terms of having a team of mixed incentives trying to actually do the work. But even a non-replication strategy, a non-replication scenario, you can imagine if you were doing it by yourself, you're like, well, just trust my voice that I didn't peak. Now, if there's a team, and say there's like a team of like 5, 6, 7, 8, however many individuals, then if all of them say, we assure you, none of us have looked and sort of like signed sort of a testimony saying like, we did not peek at the data. And that's something that we tried with the study to see if that added to credibility. And we found that that was something that really helped a lot of readers feel more at ease in terms of like, yeah, we feel pretty convinced that these people didn't peak because there's multiple people that are attesting to this, that they themselves didn't do it, and they know that their colleagues did not do it, right? So there's ways of maybe creating some kind of agreement, and then with multiple people involved, it sort of reduces the likelihood that the team has peaked, right? Like their voice seems to be more believable, right? As it relates to replication studies, there's some real value in terms of leveraging the fact that, like, if we're thinking of things like elections, we know that there are going to be more elections. When there are movements, there will be more movements. Like, we know that there's going to be more data that's going to be added to studies. So when we're doing replications, essentially you can get sort of new data for the purposes of replications by just leveraging the passage of time. And so with replications, instead of actually using the original data set that the authors proposed, like you can sort of say, like, I collected new data to fully test the replication by leveraging the fact that years have passed, and so like more data was added. And so you can actually credibly propose a pre-analysis plan, because even though a subset of data was available, there's a component of the data that wasn't made available. So you can pre-register that and show like, yes, I understand that not all, like I had some of this data at my disposal, but there's a part that wasn't at my disposal. And so here's the timestamp of when I pre-registered this from when that data became available, right? So if I'm really interested in elections, I might want to pre-register something now before the 2020 results come in, right? Because that's a new observation for this data set that's important if I'm studying things like elections and voter outcomes, right? And so this was the study that I did with my colleagues. And I thought, just as I'm going to have you all look at it in greater depth, because I invite you to criticize us, even though it's forthcoming, so there's only so much we can do with it. But I want you all to criticize us to see if it was sort of believable, and then just see like what sort of things come up for you all, as this is a conversation that's still being had in terms of like how do we create processes that allow then observational studies to really be thinking thoughtfully about transparency. So when we're thinking about the ingredients of a pre-analysis plan, right, at minimum you need to be showing like the basic research design, right, the how, like what are you going to do, right? The other part is a data description, right? Like how many years, how many observations, what kind of data is it, where was it being sampled from, so forth. Really important, what hypotheses are you trying to test with that data, right? Like you want to pre-specify what it is that you are testing. And then some information around your inference strategy, right? Like what is the process that you are going to use to test that hypothesis? So at minimum, right, like these are the components that should be present in a pre-analysis plan. And these are sort of additional things that may be helpful to have, but these are sort of like additional flesh on the bare bones that I shared with you, right? So the additional things that might be good to include is like maybe a much more detailed model, right? Heterogeneity analyses. So like if you're thinking about different subgroups that might have different kinds of effects, and like you want to look at like, well, when I'm looking at say predictors of voter turnout, if I think something like education is going to look differently among older populations versus younger populations or something, right? So like noting that these are heterogeneity tests that you are looking to do. If there are a priori a set of robustness checks that you're already thinking may be useful to do, sort of noting that. And then because you haven't fully examined the data, having some contingencies for data issues, right? Like what do you do if there's a lot of missing data? Like how are you going to use like list-wise deletion? Are you going to do imputation strategies? Like what are you going to do? So like noting some contingencies in case there's going to be data issues arise, or a measure that you thought like you were going to use like these 10 measures, but it turns out one measure is like junk because there was a translation issue or something. So like documenting things that you were going to check for. With that said, like as I note these things, it's really hard to actually come up with all of these until like maybe you actually look at the data and see like, I didn't think this issue was going to be a problem. And so those are fine to do. And if you've looked at studies that have used pre-analysis plans, you'll often see that there are these footnotes of this was not pre-registered, but we did this for this reason, right? And that's perfectly acceptable. So you shouldn't be paralyzed and think like, oh my goodness, I don't think I can come up with 100% of the things that may come up, because in the research process, I have discovered that there's always things that I discover with the data that I could not have foreseen. And so it feels really daunting to like note all of these things in advance. And so it's noting to the best of your ability what you're going to try and do. And then what this forces you to do is when you're actually writing the study and like realize there's a series of things that came up that you didn't foresee, you can put in a footnote, and in some cases you can also submit like an addendum, right? And obviously the addendum to the pre-analysis plan, there's sort of this issue that timestamp is maybe after after the pre-analysis plan was submitted. But it is, when you're submitting an addendum, you're basically saying, like, I'm going to flesh out all of the reasons for why I did some like additional kind of work, or I treated and measured differently. So if you want to be a lot more clear about all of the reasons why you are deviating from a pre-analysis plan or doing something different, you can always submit an addendum, and that also acts as a document of, I'm just trying to be fully transparent with the reader here. And I think it goes a long way to foster trust, even though that timestamp didn't quite work in your favor. It's sort of recognizing, I think, among anyone who does research, that it's hard to have foreseen 100% of the things that may come up when you're doing that work. So these sort of are the excess ingredients that may be in a pre-analysis plan, but these are often the issues that might end up in an addendum or may end up in a footnote when you're writing the paper and say, like, I also did this additional analysis for this reason, even though it wasn't pre-registered, right? But what's really nice about the pre-analysis plan is it's forcing authors to be really clear about the rationale in a way that you might not feel that you need to if that pre-analysis plan didn't exist. So I think it just goes a long way in terms of fostering really good habits. Okay. So just as a short activity, like I said, I'm going to share sort of my forthcoming work. It's a full paper, so I just want you to look at the design section. And so what the purpose of this is to look at the questions that you need to answer in an OSF pre-analysis plan, right? So what I did was, we're going to assign you to 6 breakout groups, and in each group is just assigned to one component, right? But then you all have full access to the full deck, so you can see like all of the questions that need to be answered. And it's going to ask, like, maybe in about like within like 10-15 minutes, to think about, well, how would you answer that question in light of what is presented in the paper? I know we're sort of going backwards here, right? Like, normally you're writing a pre-analysis plan before there's a paper. Here I'm presenting you with the paper, and I'm asking you to answer some questions around the pre-analysis plan. And I will also share with you the pre-analysis plan so that you can also sort of see what was pre-registered, and you'll see that there was not only a pre-analysis plan, there was that addendum that I mentioned is something that often comes up, just to sort of show what happened in our process that made us feel that it was useful to note the addendum. But hopefully this will just be a useful exercise where collectively we're writing a pre-analysis plan based upon a study that was already generated. But it like hopefully sort of shows you, like, okay, given what's in the paper, this is the kind of thing that should have been in a pre-analysis plan. And then at a later time, you can look at the pre-analysis plan to sort of see, well, what was actually in there? Like I said, after that, I welcome any sort of criticisms and questions, because I think the process by which you generate this, like by like being part of creating the sausage, you sort of see like, huh, this was easy, this was tricky, and so forth, right? So if you don't mind, Vanessa is going to just assign you to 6 groups. There might just be like 2 or 3 of you in there. Based upon your room number, just go to the relevant slide in the slide deck, right? Like, you don't have to work on all the questions. I chunked up the pre-analysis plan into 6 parts. And then just as like a pair or the 3 of you, just sort of like jot down notes. These don't have to be cohesive sentences. This is just asking you to like look at the document and see, like, how would I answer this question in light of the information that I have in front of me? Any questions around that process? Well, I don't know, maybe you can use sort of like a hand raising function or just something to alert Vanessa if you have any reactions to reactions as you went through this process of trying to answer a question that is typically asked in a pre-analysis plan.
I'm keeping my eye on the participant list, so if you want to raise your hand through that feature, that would be great.
And otherwise, we can also go through some of the questions that I think came up that I hadn't answered yet. Great. Elaine, go ahead.
So we were on the last slide, which asked about which inference criteria were used. And I guess my question was, you seem to have used just the standard levels that seem to be used in political science without justifying it. Is it becoming common practice to either justify the use or to use more stringent inference criteria?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of what's normalized within the field, right? That 0.05 is what's typical. And if you deviate from that, I think there's more need to justify. With that said, if you have, say, like a multiple hypothesis testing scenario where you have lots of outcomes, then there are different techniques for saying, like, well, what is like, right, the appropriate p-value to use in light of, say, you know, if you had like 10 outcome variables that you're looking at, and then you run the risk of kind of getting like one or two false positives just by chance. So I think when you're in a world with like multiple outcomes, then it's important to sort of delineate that and like what your strategy is. But otherwise, I think there's really very little need to justify a 0.05. You have to justify more if you're deviating from that, right? If you're doing, say, like a one-tail test, or if you think that really 0.05 is too stringent in light of like how noisy data can be. There certainly have been conversations around like field studies, right? Like if you're in a laboratory, like a lot of things are much more controlled, but if you're in a field, there's a lot more noise. And so there have been some discussions around like maybe the threshold should be different for like a lab study versus a field study, because a lab study is a lot more controlled. So there may be like slightly different norms. And then because there are these debates, like you might be able to sort of like argue, like I'm going to use a different threshold that, you know, my like colleagues like within my space are saying it's appropriate in light of how noisy the data is. Is Sean, is that the right pronunciation, or Sean?
The second one's closer. It's Sean, like brown.
Great, yeah.
So we had the measurement section, how the variables are measured. And I guess I just had a general question. I think this is a discipline-specific question that I have. In my discipline, I'm in social behavioral sciences and public health. And typically what we like to do is have like a table of the variables and how they're measured at the end of a paper. So I'm wondering, do you think that approach might be good to have in a pre-analysis plan? So it's just easier to look at all the variables and how they're being measured?
Absolutely, absolutely. And with this study, I mean, we ended up having like a very long, lengthy appendix and so forth. But yeah, I think tables are very useful, like having like the full, I think like raw, right? Like what is sort of the raw value, and then what was the coding scheme that you use, like if you didn't use sort of the raw values, right? Whether it's just sort of like transforming it, standardizing it, indexing it, you know, whatever you're doing with it. So like showing and presenting what are the raw values, and then like what are you doing with said raw values, and like what are your choices in terms of like if someone gives like X kind of response, you're going to throw it away, right? Saying like if you ask things like how many hours do you work, and they say 25 hours, like that came up with one of my students. I was like, well, that seems like a good reason for dropping that observation, like when they're noting a response as like not humanly possible.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, all of that stuff. Great.
Thanks.
And I do want to sort of note like a lot of the things that were in the paper, and I will share the pre-analysis plan with you all. The paper was very easy to write because the pre-analysis plan was so detailed. And so like if you're like not fully bought into the pre-analysis plan, like where there's like these like nice efficiency gains is because you laid out all of sort of like your motivation, your theory, like your research question, like what your theory of change is that you're really testing and all of that. Like those are the things that are in like a final paper. And so if those things are all very clear, like all your measurement, like all of that is very clear, then the paper itself like writes itself. So that's a nice feature for having detailed pre-analysis plans. It like makes the writing part a lot simpler. Any other questions?
I don't see any more hands raised, but we could go from the question queue from earlier.
Great.
Biranu?
Yeah, previously I asked before you presented about what we expect in the observational data before we get access. So I think you have addressed that one, because most of the time when you have observational data, you don't see what is in the data and how it is measured, and which is completely different from what you planned. So my question was what you're gonna do and how you deal with this pre-registration when that happens.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Obviously, if you don't have access to like a survey instrument, right, like you just like know like there's this data that's going to be made available like 2 months from now, but you have like no idea what's going to be in that data, then that doesn't sort of create that context for being able to credibly write a precise, like fully fleshed out pre-analysis plan. Like you can only write something based upon what you know. So if you have some sense, like I know that these these census numbers are going to then become available, right? Like if you have like some sense that at least you can write to that part, but you won't be able to write to the things that you don't know. So you might be able to do sort of like a kind of a smaller pre-analysis plan and like lay out sort of like this is what I know and this is what I don't know. And you can sort of note like I know that this data is going to be of value to me for like my research question because it's going to have X kinds of data. So you can sort of like note, you can note what you know and what you don't know, right? As if you look at sort of the pre-analysis plans that are in OSF, like I would recommend that you sort of like look through, you'll see a broad range. Like you'll see some that are like really short memos, and then you'll see others that are like, well, that looks like a book, right? In terms of like, that's like 80 pages and like so many details. And the 80 pages and so many details, like you can do if you have a lot of information about the data that you're going to get, right? You can't write that if you only have like a part of the information. And so I would advise like perfection shouldn't be the enemy of trying to be part of doing transparent work, because you can at least pre-specify and pre-register based upon the things that you do know. And you can note like, these are the things I don't know. And in light of what I don't know, like when I get the data, these are the things that I intend to do to then be able to answer like this question that I'm interested in. And then perhaps like submit an addendum where yes, the addendum was written after you got access to the data, but you're still engaging and trying to do transparent work, right? And like sort of like you started with like, here's my starting point, and at least your research question didn't suddenly change, right? So like, it's like, that is still the same. I just now have this additional information to provide a lot more details in terms of how I'm going to move forward in light of seeing the data. And so that addendum might be a lot richer.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any
Next on the queue, we have Jeffrey.
Oh, yeah. So I've done pre-analysis plans for observational studies. It's an area that I know, as you obviously know, there's a lot of debate about where, what's defined as credible demonstration of not looking at the data. And I guess when I think about using pre-analysis plans and observational studies, I'm less concerned about like that credibility issue. Like, did you credibly, file this before you looked at the data? And I'm more concerned about, tying people's hands to like, not just dropping a few observations at the end so you get that p-value that you want. Because I think if you're going to be like Michael LaCour and you're going to fabricate your data, you're going to fabricate anything that you need to demonstrate that you've done this thing. Yeah. And so like you brought up the LSMS, and when you access the LSMS, you have to, tell the World Bank what you're going to use it for. You have to make a data request. And it's not very, you could obviously fabricate that too. Yeah. But I think at this point, we want to push researchers to think about, at the very least, registering their hypotheses. Yeah. Kaufman and Niederle talk about, and like, communicating that this is a way that we should be thinking about designing we should think about designing our observational research the same way we think about designing our experimental research. And yeah, there'll be different levels of credibility of those pre-specified designs, but that we shouldn't discourage people who are using, you know, existing data sets from sitting down and thinking about ahead of time. And as a reviewer, you might not give it as much credibility as you would something else, but I would still, as a reviewer, you know, greatly appreciate ability to go and look at a pre-specified design, and then I'd assign some probability to it of like how, you know, did this happen beforehand or not?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You know, if you've all gone through sort of being on the reviewer side, like I think you appreciate scholars that seem to be trying to like share as much information as possible. Like here are like my exact questions, like here's like exactly what I did. And that cultivates sort of a level of trust in the writer, right? So again, sort of like don't let perfection be the enemy of like being engaging and trying to do this process, because like if you can at least sort of do what you can with the data that you have available, the information you have available, like that shines through for the reader and like fosters greater trust. And I think is just like better for the broader process that we're engaging in to cultivate trust to researchers, because as scholars, like all we have are our reputations. And the moment in which we lose trust, like if people don't trust what we do, then all of that goes out the window, right? So it's like trying to engage in cultivating that trust, and in cultivating that trust, it's you can at least pre-register your hypotheses. You can pre-register what data you're going to use. You can pre-register what kind of exploratory process you're going to do, right? It might be a shorter report because again, you don't have all the details, but at least if you like know and have a mind to like, yeah, like if I like remove some of this data, like I can start cooking things to make it, right? So like you're noting like, this is what I'm going to do. And so where I started, remember, was with observational studies, especially with data that is really easy to access, right? There's transparency in that anyone can access that data. They can go and check the raw data. And if someone wanted to do the work, they can sort of see like, it seems like you dropped like 10% of your data here. That seems fishy, right? So in that sense, like that's where observational studies drawing from public data can actually be a friend, because it means like anyone can access that and check that. And so like it sort of hopefully incentivizes people to be really careful because anyone can verify. So you can note all these things. So yeah, Jeffrey, I totally agree. Any other questions? And in the chat, I just noted the link, the OSF link, where the pre-analysis plan for the study that I had you all look at is, like, if you wanted to look at the pre-analysis plan and how that compares to the actual paper, and you're like, you'll sort of see like, seems like similar in length, right? Like it's, because we had a lot of information, because again, it was like a replication study of data that already existed, like, but bringing in some prospective data. Any other questions, Vanessa?
We have 4 more questions. Please correct me if I mispronounce your name. Sharada?
Hi, sorry, my name is Sharda. Can you hear me? Sorry, I'm sitting in my cube, so I have to wear my mask. Okay. So the question that I had is that, like, I study finance and it's very related to economics, and I think that an issue, but not an issue, but it seems to be that these days, something that can really drive a paper is really interesting data. And generally, I think that something that maybe I feel like either I've completely misinterpreted, or this is just, it seems kind of antithetical to everything we're talking about, is the idea of like getting really interesting data and looking at it and finding some kind of stylized fact or finding some kind of pattern and thinking like, okay, this is my motivation for whatever research question I want to do, right? Which is very like orthogonal to what we've been talking about. Yeah. So I just want to know what your views are on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think not all, like sometimes like as you're exploring a particular hypothesis, you might like discover something else that's like really interesting just by kind of doing work on the data. I think we're not sort of at a stage in which it just like makes sense to throw that out the window, especially if that was sort of a discovery, right? So I don't think anyone would say that all studies have to be pre-registered, because the way in which findings are discovered, it doesn't always lend itself for pre-registering. So this is more the, if you are being prospective with a particular kind of question, try to pre-register what you can, right? Because you can at least pre-register your question, the data that you're looking to do, even if it's slim on some of the details, and then maybe you submit an addendum thereafter. But if you, in the process of having some interesting data, you discover something new that like is worth publishing because people like would really be interested in knowing about it, it's okay that it wasn't pre-registered, right? I don't think there's an expectation that 100% of studies be pre-registered, because those who have done scholarly work like realize sometimes discoveries like sort of like happen when you're not actually expecting it.
Sorry, before we continue, I just wanted to make a note. I know that the other session, the next session is scheduled to start just about now based on the agenda. However, we do have 15 minutes extra. So the other group will also go for 15 minutes. So just by staying here, you're not going to miss out the last talk of the day.
And I won't be offended if anyone needs to pop out. And while that happens, I'll just note that, you know, OSF, like you can sort of see that observational study is actually an option for like pre-registering on an OSF, which is really nice, as not all registries actually give an option for observational studies. And I would say, like kind of to that last question, that not all studies can really be registered, like all observational studies can't be pre-registered, but there's a lot where you can, right? And so like the goal is like do as much as you can, because if everyone is sort of interested in trying to do transparent work, it sort of elevates faith that people have in the broader research community, which is good for all of us, right? The moment in which there is a liqueur or like someone that makes it into the New York Times that sort of talks about fraudulent data, like that harms all of us, right? So the more we can do sort of to better this community and like create trust by trying to pre-register, by trying to be very transparent, like I think just that sort of attitude and approach goes a long way of building faith for the entire academic community. So for those of you who have to go, like here's my contact information if you want to reach out. Like I do respond, so like I'm available, and I know Alex and Katie made my office hours available too, so I'm happy to have more conversations with each and every one of you. But for those of you who can stay later and have more questions, I'm happy to answer more questions.
Shaun, I think this is the last person I have on the queue. Go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I was really intrigued by the idea of a mixed team when doing a replication. And in such a situation, I would imagine there's at least some level of motivation on the original authorship team to do this kind of thing. But I'm thinking of a situation where perhaps the findings are not to the original author's liking, or they have different views on what should be reported and how things should be interpreted. So I was just thinking, in these conditions, does one need like a little extra in the PAP, or some kind of agreement between the teams about how things are going to be analyzed, interpreted, and reported?
Yeah, absolutely. So like in this study, I was one of the original authors along with Neil Malhotra, and then Greg Huber and Matthew Graham were of the like non-original author variety. And so part of the reason, and like I said, I provided the link for the pre-analysis plan. Part of the motivation of being very detailed was then we're like, okay, we're all agreeing on this. No takesy-backsies. Like this is what we're agreeing upon. And so when we actually implemented, like we reported exactly what was in the pre-analysis plan, but what happened was like we had conversations around like, well, there's this thing that was unexpected. And so we noted those in the appendix and like noted that and talked about and like were explicit when we did any kind of work and reported it that wasn't pre-specified, right? So then like there's a level of like people sort of like noting, yes, there are some conversations that occurred because we had some disagreements and we're like, well, it seems like we didn't foresee this issue coming up, and it seems like we should report that even though we technically didn't pre-register it. So it was then like we noted it and we were very clear, not pre-registered. And then it's like here's like these were pre-registered. And the pre-registered things were in the main text, whereas the non-pre-registered we chose to put in the appendix, but like still wrote to it a little bit in the results so that the readers sort of knew what we sort of took away from the whole body of evidence that we saw in front of us. I know that mixed teams, like this sort of came up when I presented this in another setting around like power dynamics too, is like, what if in the mixed team, like one person is really senior and like, you know, the other people are really junior and the senior person like wants a particular kind of result, how to navigate that. And like those are tricky, right? Those are tricky and that's not an easy answer. And I think that sort of goes to like broader conversations around how do we manage like power dynamics within academia, because that's not good for honesty, right? Like it's important if a junior person has a really valid concern that that person be able to speak up and not just kind of keep it to themselves because of concerns. So I think that that sort of speaks to the broader conversations we're having around kind of like what should the academic community generally be. But the mixed team, like in theory, like there's an element of like it's really hard for a group to lie together. Like someone's going to like slip up and say like, actually, like, you know, so that's sort of the idea, like what happens like when there's a team. And I think, you know, in natural sciences, you see these like large teams publishing together. That's less of a thing in social science. But I think like there is now some value that we're seeing in like what happens when there are kind of larger teams, like maybe not a team of like 40, right? But like when you have like teams of like 3, 4, or 5 people, that like there is an element of transparency that can go up when you have a group that's holding each other accountable, and like where it's like much more difficult to like lie as like a team of 5 than like if it were a person of 1, right? Easier for Lacour to lie by himself than like if there was like a group that sort of saw what he was doing.
The last question I have is about your contact info. Should we put it in the chat or?
My contact info, do you see my slides?
Not anymore.
Oh, got it. Thank you. Great. Yeah, so there's my email, ceciliahmo@berkeley.edu, and then have a professional website, and there you can find articles and basically the examples that I noted here. And like I said, yeah, I'm open to all of you. So if you want to connect and ask questions about any aspect of your work, I'm happy to connect with you. And I do have office hours too that I know Alex and Katie shared. So happy to talk through any specific things about your work. Thank you so very much. It was very, very nice to see all of you. I hope you have a wonderful workshop, rest of your workshop.